guys, so today we continue on with Mr. Paddington, who was terribly confused last time because he thought that he was worth his weight in gold, remember? And he didn't understand that that just meant that they thought that Paddington was very valuable. And so he was trying to figure out his real weight and how much gold that would be. And we also met that he has a new friend named Mr. Grubber who works in the shops. Mr. Grubber listened carefully to all that Paddington had to tell him, and then closed his eyes and thought for a moment. He was a kindly man, and he didn't want to disappoint Paddington. "I've no doubt," he said at last, "that you're worth that. You're obviously a very valuable young bear. I know it. Mr. and Mrs. Brown know it. Mrs. Bird knows it. But do other people?" He looked at Paddington over his glasses. "Things aren't always what they seem in this world, Mr. Brown," he said sadly. Paddington sighed. It was very disappointing. "I wish they were," he said. "It would be nice." "Perhaps," said Mr. Grubber mysteriously. "Perhaps. But we shouldn't have any more surprises then, should we?" He took Paddington into his shop, and after offering him a seat, disappeared for a moment. When he returned, he was carrying a large picture of a boat. At least half of it was a boat. The other half seemed to be the picture of a lady in a large hat. "There you are," he said proudly. "That's what I meant by things not always being what they seemed. I'd like your opinion on it, Mr. Brown." Paddington felt rather flattered, but also puzzled. The picture didn't seem to be one thing or the other, and he said so. "Ah," said Mr. Grubber delightedly, "it isn't at the moment, but just you wait until I've cleaned it. I gave 50 pence for that picture years and years ago when it was just a picture of a sailing ship. And what do you think? When I started to clean it the other day, all the paint began to come off, and I discovered that there was another painting underneath." He looked around and then lowered his voice. "Nobody else knows," he whispered, "but I think the one underneath may be valuable. It may be what they call an old master." Seeing that, Paddington still looked puzzled. He explained to him that in the old days, when artists ran short of money and couldn't afford any canvas to paint on, they sometimes painted on top of old pictures. And sometimes, very occasionally, they painted them on top of pictures by artists who afterwards became famous and whose pictures were worth a lot of money. But as they had been painted over, no one knew anything about them. "It all sounds very complicated," said Paddington thoughtfully. Mr. Gruber talked for a long time about painting, which was one of his favorite subjects. But Paddington, though he was usually interested in anything Mr. Grubber had to tell him, was hardly listening, eventually refusing Mr. Grubber's offer of a second cup of cocoa. He slipped down off of the chair and began making his way home. He raised his hat automatically whenever someone said good day to him, but there was a faraway expression in his eyes. Even the smell of buns from the bakery passed unheeded. Paddington had an idea. When he got home, he went upstairs to his room and lay on the bed for a long while, staring up at the ceiling. He was up there so long that Mrs. Bird became quite worried and poked her head round the door to know if he was all right. "Quite all right, thank you," said Paddington distantly. "I'm just thinking." Mrs. Bird closed the door and hurried downstairs to tell the others. Her news had a mixed reception. "I don't mind him just thinking," said Mrs. Brown, with a worried expression on her face. "It's when he actually thinks of something that the trouble starts." But she was in the middle of her housework and soon forgot the matter. Certainly, both she and Mrs. Bird were much too busy to notice the small figure of a bear creeping cautiously in the direction of Mr. Brown's shed. A few minutes later, nor did they see him return armed with a bottle of Mr. Brown's paint remover and a large pile of rags. Had they done so, they might have had a good cause to worry. And if Mrs. Brown had seen him creeping on tiptoe into the drawing room, closing the door carefully behind him, she would have had a minute's peace. She wouldn't have had a minute's peace. Fortunately, everyone was much too busy to notice any of these things. Even more fortunately, no one came into the drawing room for quite a long while, because Paddington was in a mess. Things hadn't gone at all according to plan. He was beginning to wish that he had listened more carefully to the things Mr. Grubber had said on the subject of cleaning paintings. To start with, even though he'd used almost half a bottle of Mr. Brown's paint remover, the picture had only come off in patches. Secondly, and what was even worse, where it had come off, there was nothing underneath, only the white canvas. Paddington stood back and surveyed his handiwork. Originally, it had been a painting of a lake with a blue sky and several sailing boats dotted around. Now, it looked like a storm at sea. All the boats had gone. The sky was a funny shade of gray, and half the lake had disappeared. What a good thing I found this old box of paints, he thought, as he stood back holding the end of the brush at paw's length and squinting at it as he'd once seen a real artist do. Holding a palette in his left paw, he squeezed some red paint onto it and then splodged it about with the brush. He looked nervously over his shoulder and then dabbed some of it onto the canvas. So, oh me, oh my, boys and girls. Paddington, let's go over what he's done. Mr. Grubber told him about a painting that he had bought. And when he began to clean the painting, he found that there was another painting underneath. And Mr. Grubber believes that the painting that's underneath is like a secret treasure, and it's worth a lot of money. So Paddington has this wonderful idea. He thinks any painting might have a treasure painting underneath it. And so he has found all of Mr. Brown's things for painting, and he's brought them into the house. So he has something called paint remover, and he has rags, and he has more paint. And he has snuck into the Browns' drawing room, which is a room where Mr. Brown does his artwork. And when he's in there, Mr. Brown has a beautiful picture that he's been working days on of some boats sailing. And Paddington has taken the paint remover and he has put it all over the painting because he wants to see what's underneath of it. But there's really nothing underneath it because Mr. Brown had made that painting himself. And now Paddington is taking the paint and putting it back up onto the painting. Mr. Brown doesn't know Paddington's doing this. Mrs. Brown doesn't know. And Judy and Jonathan don't know. And Paddington is making a great big mess. We'll have to read more tomorrow to find out what happens next. Have a good afternoon.